We are back on Inside Politics today. We're looking at Nashville's leadership role in the early 1960s in the civil rights movement, more particularly the sit-in movement here in Nashville. We're talking with Dr. Reavis Mitchell from Fisk University. He's a history professor there, and David Ewing, who's a Nashville historian. David, you want to talk a little bit about how all this got started as well?
Yeah, the students led this movement because they were more idealistic, of course, about how society in America should be. But the other reason was they knew that they were going to get arrested. And if you got arrested and you didn't show up to work on Monday, you don't have a job anymore. If you were a student at Fisk University and you got arrested, your professor said, good job, and sent your homework to jail.
And these schools were the African-American schools, that many of which are still operating in Nashville today.
Oh, yes.
Right?
Yeah. Fisk University, Tennessee State, American Baptist College.
Now, were there any danger, Dr. Mitchell, of these students being expelled from school? Did they get in trouble? They didn't lose a job, but did they lose their
one
position?
of the heroes of the movement that we really don't talk about was Fisk University President Dr. Stephen J. Wright. Stephen J. Wright decreed that no student would be expelled from Fisk for being involved in these activities, and encouraged the faculty to support that. Now, that's not to say that everybody was together and moving. That was great generational divide. No parent ever called Fisk and said, I want to make sure my son or daughter gets arrested. In fact, they would call and say, if my student is arrested, I'm going to bring them home.
And these students were not just arrested; they were taken to court. They were fined, and then, since they refused to pay the fines, they were put in jail.
Yeah, and of course Vanderbilt kicked out James Lawson from the Vanderbilt Divinity School because he got arrested in these nonviolent protests.
And even today, when it's I get a lot of students from California, and they're very romanticizing the movement. But I have to tell them many times an arrest record will keep you out of law school.
Yes.
Several law schools will not. Several medical schools, if you've been arrested, you can't.
And you talk as well about how divisive the civil rights movement was, even within the African-American community itself, particularly generationally.
There was no inaction between the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the NAACP or the Urban League. These were generationally different type groups.
Now, the sit-ins went on for several weeks. There were continuing arrests and continuing situations like that. Was there a concern at one time that this was not having an impact because there was not being any integration happening? None of the lunch counters downtown changed. There was also a boycott going on with businesses. What kind of impact did that have?
The students thought that they would eventually be victorious, and they were, but this was not going to happen overnight just because they occupied these lunch stools and these restaurants. If you've never been to Woolworth, when my mother was at Fisk University with John Lewis and Diane Nash, she couldn't eat at Woolworth, and now people proudly go back to Woolworths now because it's a restaurant, and they never got to eat there when they were back in the 60s.
But what an emotional victory to have the mayor of Nashville stand on the courthouse steps and declare to Diane Nash that he didn't think segregation.
Let's talk about that. There was also apparently, Mayor West, before that day, and we'll talk about it in just a second, he appointed a group to study. There was, in fact, some of the presidents of the universities, the black universities, were involved. They came back and sort of recommended a separate but equal. They would have some sections of the restaurants set up for blacks and some for whites. Obviously, the students didn't buy that. That didn't go anywhere. But was that sort of an effort?
That was a new form of Jim Crow, and that was totally unacceptable. It was interesting. There was a black section of the bus. There was a black section of the movie theater. There was never a black section of the lunch counter.
This all came to a head in a very unexpected way. In fact, perhaps the most violent thing that happened was the bombing of Z. Alexander Luby's house. Luby was sort of the head of a lot of the lawyers that were representing the students when they went to court. His house was bombed one morning in April of 1960.
Exactly.
The house was destroyed. Fortunately, he and his wife were not injured. This sort of led to a march. 4,000 people marched downtown to the courthouse.
Some historians said that was the modern shot heard around the world. The modern shot for beginning the movement. And it was. And it organized, and it galvanized, and it got covered on the evening news.
Yes. And the very next day, Dr. King changed his schedule, came to Nashville to speak at Fisk University. And that very famous quote that we have in the civil rights room of the public library that says, I did not come here to give inspiration, I came here to gain inspiration from this great movement in Nashville. King said that on the heels of the march.
He said what was going on in Nashville was the best organized and most disciplined effort in the Southland.
Yes.
Yes. But there were serious repercussions. Just now we've been looking at the students at Tennessee State who for years were expelled with no degrees. the president of Tennessee State had to make a decision.
The Freedom Riders.
Yeah, after all, it was a state school. So those students who had morphed from sit-in to Freedom Riders had their whole lives changed by this.
Let's talk specifically about what happened when the march ended at the courthouse. Mayor Ben West came out to speak to the students, and he said something that changed the entire tenor and direction of the sit-in movement and actually led to its victory. David, tell us about what happened.
Well, Diane Nash was chosen to speak. This was in C.T. Vivian, and she asked the mayor not if segregation was right, was it morally right? And in front of 4,000 people staring at him in front of his courthouse, he said, no, it's not morally right. And that kind of changed the tide, and the students felt that they had actually been heard.
At that point, there were negotiations that began between the city, the downtown businesses, and the students. And over just the next few weeks, there was actually a agreement. And very slowly, they began to integrate the
and it was decided it would be very slowly. To some of the students, especially John Lewis and others, it was too slow. It wasn't moving rapid enough to be forgotten about. But still, that great psychological victory. In other cases, we had seen governors from Alabama and Arkansas come before crowds and decry that segregation would last forever. And suddenly in Nashville, Tennessee, in our home, in the Athens of the South, the governor acquiesces and says segregation is wrong. That was a large step.
That was different, David. I mean, we had mayors even after that would not come out and meet with protesters when they came to the courthouse, but Mayor West did.
They sent a telegram actually in advance to say, we're marching and we're coming, please come out and talk to us. There was no Twitter or cell phones, and he did. To his Mayor West credit, he came out and actually treated the students with respect and heard them out.
David Ewing, Nashville historian's our guest, along with Dr. Reavis Mitchell from Fisk University. We're talking about the Nashville sit-in movement, Nashville's leadership role in the civil rights movement beginning back in the early 1960s. Back to continue our conversation after this break.